Hello, Dominic here from the Bournemouth Writing Festival. Looking forward to welcoming you on the 26th, 27th and 28th of April 2024. Now, we have 101 different writing activities and events happening over the 3 days. And included in that are some networking events. So we have several networking events for you to come along to and meet other writers to collaborate and connect. The first one is on Friday night, which is our Friday night social, which is going to be at Flirt Cafe. Then in the morning, we have what we're calling genre breakfasts. So if you write in a particular genre, you go along to one of our local independent cafes to meet other writers writing in those genres. So for example, if you write for the screen or for theatre, you can go to see Lynn in Leo's Cafe. Or if you write for young adults, you could go and see Adriana in Picnic Park, Delhi. We've got lots and lots happening over the weekend on the Saturday and Sunday at 9 a.m. and they're free to go. But if you can please support our local independent cafes with a coffee or two, that would be amazing. And then at lunch times and at dinner times, we've selected a couple of our independent restaurants for you to go and have lunch or dinner with other writers attending the festival. They're going to be hosted and they will be there to welcome you and to get the conversations started. So they're between 12 and 2 for lunch and 5 and 7 for dinner. So check out the website to see what restaurants you can go to where other writers are going to be in those meal times. Now, one of the 101 writing events and activities is on adaptation, and I'm delighted to say that Brian Sibley and Gary Dalkin are here with me today to talk about their session, The Art of Adaptation and Other Fantastic Stories, which is going to be happening on Saturday, the 27th of April at 4:30 p.m. at Pavilion Dance. Now, Brian Sibley is a writer with over 100 hours of radio drama to his name and has presented hundreds of radio documentaries, features, and weekly programs. He is widely known as the author of many film making of books, including those for the Harry Potter film series and the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit trilogies. And now there's a little Bournemouth connection there because J.R.R. Tolkien used to holiday at the Hotel Miramar. And if you're going to the literary walk of Bournemouth with Hattie Miles, you will be going to the Miramar Hotel to hear some stories and anecdotes on that. Brian's radio work has spanned titles from Winnie the Pooh right through to the Chronicles of Narnia and Roald Dahl. He won the Sony Radio Award in 1985. Hello, Brian. Welcome.
Hi, Dominic. Great to be with you.
Thank you for coming and joining me today. So Gary Dalkin is an editor who helps writers with their structural and developmental edits. He regularly writes for Writing Magazine, who will coincidentally also be at the festival. So welcome, Gary.
Hello, great to be here, Dominic.
Thank you for joining me. So Brian, let's start with you. Tell us a little bit about your writing journey, because it's fascinating. I could have talked for hours about all the different things you've done. So tell us a little bit about what you've done and how you got into adapting some of those wonderful, famous titles that I just mentioned.
Well, perhaps the most famous is The Lord of the Rings by Mr. Tolkien, Professor Tolkien, I should say, really. And that was totally accidental. And I mentioned that not in order to say, oh, wasn't I lucky to be able to do something which I wasn't actually expecting. It's important that you writers understand that there's always an element of luck involved in what you do, you know, and that was the case for me with The Lord of the Rings. So I was quite young, quite inexperienced, but somebody at the BBC had the confidence, could have been misplaced, happily it wasn't, that I could do the job, which was quite demanding because it was 26 episodes, half-hour episodes on a weekly basis of The Lord of the Rings. So I was teamed up, and this is another interesting point really for me. I was teamed up with a very, very experienced writer, a man called Michael Bakewell, who had had an amazing career in the BBC as a writer, as a director, as a producer, and had tackled such classics as War and Peace. So he came alongside me to where we split the episodes between us. I created a kind of chronology, and then we both took 13 episodes each, and that was fantastic because he wouldn't accept that he was my mentor, but in many ways he was, because there were many things that I didn't know how to do. I had no idea how to do a battle, and there were quite a few battles in Lord of the Rings. But Michael did, and he was a terrific person to sort of work alongside. And so and I've never forgotten his response to when I said, well, how do we split up these episodes between us, Michael? We've got 13 each. And he said, oh, you just take the ones you want to do. It's your project. You do it. And I'll do the ones you don't want to do. And that's the only thing that I can say about that, is that I was savvy enough and sensible enough to think there are episodes here that I do not know how to do. You know, there are enormous battles, and I had no idea how you do a battle on radio without it sounding absolutely just a cacophony of noise or totally inexplicable. So I very wisely gave him all those difficult episodes, and I chose to do all the episodes with the hobbits and Gollum and the stuff that was relatively easier to do, I think. So, but it was a great beginning, and then I got the Chronicles of Narnia and the Gormenghast novels of Mervyn Peake and T.H. White's The Once and Future King. This is across a period of 40-something years, so I've been at it for a long while now. And I've always enjoyed it, but I've always been lucky enough, or fortunate enough, to work with books that I really love. And that's something that I hope I can kind of convey in our session, actually, is that how important it is to understand the writer and understand the book, not just from a sense of how do I make this into something different, like a film or a play or a radio version, but actually what is the book about? What is it saying? What is the author wanting to convey, and how can I now use those skills of that author to make it into something different?
I was involved with the Harry Potter film series prior to starting off the writing festival, so I know how passionate the fans can be of these titles. So did you find it quite daunting to attempt and kind of get into the adaptation of these very famous and very well-known books?
Well, as I said, I've been very lucky in that I've often nearly always worked with something that I already loved. And so I had read Tolkien pretty much, well, not in the 1950s when it came out, but pretty soon in my own life. So I was already into Tolkien, and I read the Harry Potter books as they were published. I read the first two when they were still not yet considered to be classics. So I've always been steeped in these stories, and so that's been a bonus. Did I ever feel overawed by some of the projects? Yes, I think I did. And of course, if you're working with filmmakers, if you're writing about their work, which I've done for both the Potter franchise and for the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit franchise, then you need to have a good relationship with the studio. And I was particularly lucky with Lord of the Rings because I got on very well with Peter Jackson. I went on to write his biography, in fact, and they included me very much as part of the team, which meant that I had a lot of access to the cast and the crew and all the people involved, which was a wonderful benefit to be able to write a book about it. You know, I wasn't sort of just scratching around, grabbing bits and pieces here and there. So I've been fortunate. I've been blessed in many of the projects that I've done. But yes, there's always that moment when you suddenly think, particularly with these major books, that you just think, oh, word, I'm actually handling this other person's material, material which I respect or admire. That can be a bit daunting.
Okay, great. Gary, so how did this kind of session come about, and who do you think should come along to it?
Well, I was thinking, I knew Brian was on Facebook a little bit. I knew that I could get in touch with him. I'd read his biography of Peter Jackson, and last year I got asked to edit a 4-part podcast series about the golden age of piracy, a sort of adventure series with a bit of a fantasy twist. And it got me thinking that you can read endless books about screenwriting, and there's books about theatre. There's very little information available about actually adapting purely for audio drama. And at the same time, there's more interest probably than ever in that you can go on YouTube and you can just get just about any audio drama going right back to the 1940s, adaptations of classics. You can go onto Audible and you can get Brian's adaptation of The Lord of the Rings and various others. You can go to BBC Sounds and there's all sorts of stuff there. There's new dramas coming out all the time, from 15-minute ones to full-length dramas. And it occurred to me that anybody now, a bit like you could self-publish when Kindle came out, anybody can get themselves a few actors together, even some friends, get a composer, get someone they know locally. You can make your own audio drama now. You can go and get a classic novel that's out of copyright in the public domain. Anybody now can have a go. You could do Frankenstein, or you can do Dracula, or you can do any of these things. You can make your own version. And I thought, well, how amazing is that? And yet there's no information telling you how to go about it. What are the perils and pitfalls, and just some good advice how to go about doing this? How are you going to adapt one of these things? And I thought, well, let's ask Brian, because I mean, who better? Who else knows about how to do this? So let's ask him and see if he'll say yes and get him down to the festival, because it would be something quite different to all the other events. I mean, people just don't think about how the particular challenges of adapting for something like when Brian says, when Peter Jackson's doing the Lord of the Rings, he's got hundreds of millions of dollars, and he's got a cast of thousands, and he's got CGI, and he's got great big music score and all these sets and all the rest of it. And he can stage a battle with all his orcs and warriors and fighting, and you can see what's going on because he can show you it. How do you do this? How do you turn the Lord of the Rings into an audio drama that makes sense? And yet it was brilliant, and people love it, and they released it on CD. People are still listening to that 40 years later, and this was done long before the movies. So yeah, let's talk about this. This is just so exciting, and yet nobody really is talking about how do you do this.
And in terms of the people that might want to come along to this, so you've talked about adapting existing works, but I think a lot of people come to the festival, have written things and want to adapt, or thinking about how could their book or their writing go to the screen, or to an audio guide, or to radio. So do you think your session will also touch on people that want to adapt their books and novels into screen?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, it's a continuum. You've got different mediums, but you have to rethink a particular work depending on how it's going to be presented. And I think Brian's got so much expertise on that. I mean, he has worked on in television and in film, and I think some of the advice applies between different medium, and some is specific to audio. But I think anybody who's interested in adapting, whether it's pre-existing work or their own work, and translating that into a new medium, then yeah, there's going to be things they can learn. I mean, writers do this. I mean, Christopher Priest I've interviewed a couple of times, and his novel The Glamour, he adapted that for radio, and in his interviews he did find it difficult, because there are certain things in the novel that work on the page that if you turn it into another medium, well, maybe you're going to give a surprise away that was crafted in a way that is concealed by the fact that it just appears in text. But if you suddenly turn it into a different format, then you've got to present that surprise in a different way. You've got to rethink, tell the same story, but in a different way that works in that medium. And I think there's just so much to talk about how do you do this? How do you reimagine the story in a different way?
So, Brian, why don't you give us a little bit of a taster then of what you're going to be discussing, and maybe some of the tips and advice that people coming to your talk might learn? Well,
I was very struck by something that Gary just said. I remember years ago there was a radio play written. It was written as totally as a spoof by Timothy West, the actor, and the play was called "This Gun in My Left Hand is Loaded." And that really goes to the heart of the difficulty that Gary was talking about, which is how do you put something onto an audio format when in fact it's obviously got a lot of visual content to it, the story. So you never in a film see anybody say, I've got a gun in my hand here and I'm not afraid to use it. Nobody does that, because you see the gun and you know what's going to happen. But in radio, how do you draw a gun from your pocket on radio, for example? I also thought that Gary's comment was absolutely right about saying that sometimes you have to work out a completely different way to spring a surprise, which in the book is done because you can do it on the page, but which if you do it in sound, suddenly it just doesn't work. And I had a very good example of that, which I'll talk about when we meet, which was when I was adapting one of the stories of Ray Bradbury. Ray Bradbury was alive at the time. I haven't worked with many writers who've been alive. Most of my source material has long gone, so I didn't have to worry about what they thought. But Ray, who'd been a friend of mine for some 30 years, was very present and actually did the introductions to the plays. And I found a way around something which was very, very specific in the book, but was a sudden reveal in literally the last line of the story, which I could not do in audio form. And so I created a completely different ending with his approval, and he felt it worked fine. But finding those ways of doing it, and particularly if like me, you have a particular respect for the writer. I know a lot of screenwriters don't do this. I mean, the number of times I look at films and I think, has this person actually read the original book? There was perfectly good scenes there. Why are they inventing new scenes which aren't perhaps necessary? So I have a very protective attitude towards the writers whose work I have worked with. But so I want to convey some of those things to people, give them some, I hope, some amusing examples, some fairly scary tales of how things can go horribly wrong in terms of audio. But most of all, I want to convey the passion, I suppose, that I feel for telling stories in an audio form. And I have that passion simply really because that's how all storytelling began. We forget that most stories were told to people in an oral form. They're not, most stories have not survived by having been written down in books. Most of the stories which now shape our literary heritage began as being stories given by word of mouth. The fairy stories, the myth, the legend. People used to travel around Greece and perform the stories in the Odyssey and the Iliad. Nobody picked it up and read it in a book. And even as late as the Victorian era, it would be the case that not everybody could read Dickens' novels because not everybody could read. And quite often, people would club together in, say, a village or a small town. People would club together, get into groups, contribute to buying the weekly episode of Dickens' latest book. And the person who could read would then sit and read it to the other people. So many of our stories have come to us like, well, most of all, like the fairy tales, of course, which we're told when we're children. These stories are told to us, and and in the telling of them, what we have to do as a listener is envisage what the teller of the tale is giving us. And that's something which you don't have to do in film because it's all done for you, as Gary was saying. It's all there on a plate. But when you read a book, you do it in your head. And when you hear a book, you're actually hearing the story unfold without seeing the words. So you're left completely free to create the imagery yourself. And the most important thing to remember, and this is such an old quote that anybody who knows anything about radio writing will have heard many times before, but the scenery is so much better on radio.
And Gary, lastly, what takeaways are you hoping people will leave with after they've been to your session?
Well, a couple of things, really. I'm hoping that people will be inspired if they've been thinking about maybe adapting something for audio, that they will just think that they've been to this, that they'll actually go and start doing it, that they'll realize that it can be done, that they'll have some tips and some ideas. They'll have a framework where they can know what to avoid, what to look out for, some pitfalls and traps that they can avoid, and maybe just get that confidence, because so much of it's about confidence that, yeah, I can actually go and do this. It's possible, and I can't maybe get it on the radio, at least maybe not at first, but I can basically, like a show reel, I can make a podcast. Anyone can get a podcast on air and on the internet, and then who knows what can come from that. So I'd hope it would inspire people to do that. And also, because Brian's just been saying about the whole storytelling and the myths and the fairy tales, Brian's writing world's been so steeped in that great British fantasy tradition, that I would hope that we can spend a little while just talking a bit about that, and it also inspire people with that there's an endless well of the great British fantasy tradition, that going right back to Beowulf and King Arthur, and right up through Alice in Wonderland and Dracula, Frankenstein again, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which was written in Westbourne, just a few miles from us. And so many of these stories have always got connections with Bournemouth. And yeah, so just inspiring people to think, well, I could be part of that tradition. Again, it comes right up to Harry Potter. What other country in the world has got such a phenomenal tradition of this great fantasy writing? And again, you can put Winnie the Pooh, Wind in the Willows, Gormenghast. There's just so much stuff there. And it's like, it's a living tradition that these stories are developed from another. It's a sort of ongoing conversation where one writer sort of answers back to another. Like, say, for instance, Susanna Clarke with Piranesi recently. And you can see Gormenghast's influence all over that. And yet she's made it something different of it and made it her own. And it's this tradition that just goes on, and it just grows. And you've just got so much fantastic material there to draw on and be inspired by. And so, yeah, I think that's the other thing. I just hope that get people to really take the British fantasy tradition seriously and think about it again, and be re-inspired by that.
And you know, Bournemouth has got such a rich history of literary kind of foundations here, you know, from all the way from Mary Shelley, you know, to all the way to Bill Bryson, who used to work at the Bournemouth Agri. I just, you know, there's so much. All these authors came here for inspiration, and you know, and as you said, Gary, you know, some wonderful works have come out or been born from Bournemouth. So hopefully that people coming to the festival also be inspired by talks like that, but also the scenery and the kind of inspiration they have down here. So thank you so much, both of you, for joining me tonight. And it's so fantastic. I think this is a fantastic, very, very interesting topic. And I'm delighted and privileged to have both of you coming to the festival to talk about it. So thank you so much. So Brian Sibley and Gary Dalkin are going to be at the Pavilion Dance on Saturday, the 27th of April at 4:30 p.m. for their session, The Art of Adaptation and Other Fantastic Stories. So I hope to see you all at Bournemouth on the 26th, 27th and 28th of April 2024. Hope to see you there. Take care. Bye-bye.